Do me a favor and don't make me look bad while I'm away. I already warned my friends you. Those words would replay in my mind for months, but in that moment, I was still caught up in the excitement of our planned getaway. I had been working on this surprise for 18 months, every detail calculated with the precision that made me good at my job as a civil engineer. I stood in our downtown Seattle apartment, surveying the preparations I'd made for our 9-day Cabo San Lucas retreat. The matching luggage sat perfectly aligned by the door, tags filled out in my careful handwriting. I'd researched 12 different resorts before settling on Casa del Mar, a boutique property with private ocean view villas that cost more per night than most people spent on rent. The reservation confirmation was printed and filed in the travel folder I'd created, complete with backup options for every restaurant and activity. I'd even downloaded a Spanish-language app 6 months ago, practicing basic phrases during my morning commute so I could surprise Sierra by ordering our meals in passable Spanish. The effort seemed romantic at the time, though looking back, I realize I was trying too hard to impress someone who had already decided I wasn't impressive enough. The apartment sparkled from my weekend of deep cleaning. I'd vacuumed under furniture that hadn't been moved in years, organized our shared closet by color and season, and stocked the refrigerator with her favorite foods for when we returned. A bottle of Pinot Grigio was chilling, the expensive one she'd mentioned loving at her company's holiday party. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen counter, and I'd even bought those fancy French candles she sometimes lingered over at Nordstrom but never purchased. Every surface gleamed, every detail considered. I wanted her to come home to perfection before we left for paradise. My laptop displayed the custom itinerary I'd spent weeks crafting. Sunset horseback rides along the beach, couples massage at the spa, a private dinner on our villa's terrace with a chef I'd hired through the concierge. I'd mapped out the perfect balance of adventure and relaxation, factoring in her preference for late mornings and my love of exploring. There was even a backup plan for rain, though Cabo's weather in October was historically perfect. I'd cross-referenced 3 weather services and consulted with a travel agent who specialized in Mexico. Nothing was left to chance because I believed this trip would become our engagement story. For 2 months, I'd been secretly visiting jewelry stores during my lunch breaks, learning about cut and clarity, trying to understand what would make her eyes light up the way they did when she saw something beautiful. I'd narrowed it down to 3 options, all within budget if I added the overtime money I'd been saving. The ring wasn't purchased yet, but I had the sales associate's card in my wallet and a mental image of the perfect moment. Maybe during the sunset horseback ride, or perhaps on our villa's terrace while the chef prepared our final dinner. I'd rehearsed different versions of the proposal, each one feeling more real as our departure date approached. Sierra worked in marketing for a tech startup, something involving social media analytics that she explained with enthusiasm I tried to match. Her job required creativity and intuition, skills that seemed magical compared to my world of load calculations and structural specifications. She had this way of seeing possibilities where I saw problems to solve, and I admired how effortlessly she navigated social situations that left me feeling awkward. When we met at a mutual friend's housewarming party 3 years ago, I was immediately drawn to her confidence and the way she made everyone around her laugh. She was the kind of person who could walk into any room and find her place instantly, while I preferred the edges, observing and analyzing before engaging. We balanced each other, or so I thought. She helped me see beyond blueprints and building codes, while I provided the stability and planning that kept our life organized. At least, that was the story I told myself. The truth was becoming clearer with each passing month, though I wasn't ready to acknowledge it yet. The financial commitment alone demonstrated my serious intentions. 18 months of careful budgeting, skipping lunches out and buying generic groceries, choosing Netflix over concerts, all to save the $8,400 this trip would cost. I'd calculated it down to the last resort fee and airport parking charge. For someone who lived by spreadsheets and project timelines, this represented the largest discretionary expense I'd ever planned. But Sierra was worth it. She deserved to experience luxury, to feel pampered and cherished in ways her previous boyfriends had never managed. I wanted to be different, better, the kind of man who created magical experiences instead of just providing steady reliability. My engineering mind had mapped out every contingency for the trip. Alternative flights if ours were delayed, backup restaurants if our reservations fell through, even researched the nearest hospital just in case. I'd printed copies of our passports and stored them separately from the originals, purchased travel insurance that covered everything from missed connections to medical emergencies, and loaded our phones with offline maps and translation apps. Some might call it overthinking, but in my profession, preparation prevented catastrophe. I applied the same methodical approach to love that I used for designing bridges, believing that careful planning could create something beautiful and lasting. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days calculating stress loads and structural integrity, yet I'd completely missed the warning signs that my own relationship was buckling under pressure I couldn't measure. I checked my watch and felt the familiar flutter of excitement mixed with nervous anticipation. Sierra would be home from work soon, and we'd spend the evening reviewing our itinerary together. I imagined her reaction to the villa photos, the surprise dinner arrangements, the thoughtful details that proved how much this relationship meant to me. In my mind, she'd be impressed by the effort, maybe even moved to tears by the romantic gestures I'd planned. We'd pack together, sharing the anticipation of our first real vacation as a serious couple, talking about the memories we'd create and the stories we'd tell for years to come. 9 days in paradise, just the two of us, no distractions or work pressure, just quality time to reconnect and maybe take the next step toward forever. I had no way of knowing that within hours, everything I'd built would collapse faster than a poorly designed foundation. The sound of Sierra's key in the lock jolted me from my romantic daydreams back to reality, though the reality that walked through our door wasn't the woman I'd been planning this trip around. She stumbled slightly, laughing at something on her phone, wearing the kind of outfit that screamed girls' night out rather than quiet evening at home. The black sequin top and leather jacket ensemble was more suited for Vegas nightclubs than our cozy apartment, and her makeup was applied with the precision of someone planning to be photographed all night. I felt a sinking sensation as I realized she'd forgotten about our departure in less than 48 hours, or worse, she simply didn't care enough to remember. I watched her kick off her heels without so much as glancing at the perfectly arranged luggage or acknowledging the effort I'd put into making our home welcoming for her return. She was already texting someone, probably Kennedy or Avery, her weekend companions who seemed to view relationships as accessories rather than commitments. The contrast between my careful preparations and her obvious disinterest should have been my first clue about how this conversation would unfold. When I mentioned the villa booking confirmation and custom itinerary with the enthusiasm of someone sharing exciting news, her response was devastating in its casual dismissal. She barely looked up from her phone screen, offering a distracted comment about it sounding fine, whatever, like I'd asked her opinion on what brand of cereal to buy rather than sharing details of an expensive romantic getaway I'd been planning for over a year. The lack of curiosity about the sunset horseback rides, the private chef, or even basic details like our flight times revealed just how little this trip meant to her. But nothing prepared me for what came next as she applied lipstick in our hallway mirror, transforming her appearance for another night out while delivering words that would echo in my mind for months afterward. She told me to do her a favor and not make her look bad while she was away, explaining that she'd already warned Kennedy and Avery about me, describing me as, and here she paused with calculated cruelty, me being exactly what I was. The casual way she delivered this character assassination while checking her reflection suggested she'd been thinking about my inadequacies for some time, possibly discussing them with friends who viewed me as Sierra's unfortunate choice in partners. I could picture these conversations now, Kennedy and Avery exchanging knowing looks when Sierra mentioned her boyfriend the engineer, probably making jokes about pocket protectors and social awkwardness while sipping overpriced cocktails at trendy bars I couldn't afford on my sensible salary. I stood there holding the itinerary I'd spent weeks perfecting, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach by someone who was supposed to love me. The revelation that I was an embarrassment she had to manage rather than a partner she was proud to introduce cut deeper than any argument we'd ever had. In that moment, I understood that while I'd been planning our future, she'd been apologizing for my existence to friends whose approval mattered more than our relationship. The expensive trip to Cabo, the careful planning, the 18 months of savings, all of it suddenly felt pathetic rather than romantic, the desperate gestures of a man trying to prove his worth to someone who had already decided he lacked value. Kennedy was dating some tech startup founder who drove a Tesla and summered in the Hamptons, while Avery's influencer boyfriend had a six-figure social media following and looked like he'd stepped off a magazine cover. Against that backdrop of wealth and status, I was just a civil engineer with sensible shoes and a methodical approach to life, someone whose biggest excitement was a well-executed project timeline or a perfectly calculated structural load. I represented stability and reliability, qualities that had apparently become sources of shame rather than comfort in Sierra's social circle. The timing of this revelation was particularly cruel, delivered just as she prepared to leave for a weekend in Vegas where she could pretend to be single and unencumbered by someone who didn't photograph well for Instagram or impress her friends with expensive cars and designer clothes. She gathered her overnight bag with the same casual efficiency she'd used to demolish my self-worth, checking her phone for flight updates and ride-sharing notifications while I processed the magnitude of what she'd just revealed. Her friends were expecting stories about her embarrassing boyfriend's latest social missteps, not hearing about the romantic vacation he'd planned or the thoughtful gestures that proved his love. I was the punchline in conversations I wasn't even part of, the cautionary tale about settling for security over excitement, the proof that nice guys really do finish last in the game of modern relationships. As she headed toward the door, already mentally checked out and focused on her weekend of freedom, I made a decision that would surprise both of us. Instead of arguing or demanding explanations or begging her to stay home and appreciate what we had together, I simply said I understood, my voice carrying a calmness that didn't match the chaos in my head. She paused for just a moment, probably expecting the kind of emotional reaction that would give her ammunition for her friend's entertainment, but when I offered nothing but quiet acceptance, she shrugged and disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with the travel brochures and shattered illusions. The silence that followed her departure was deafening, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Seattle traffic below our window. I stood there for several minutes, still holding the custom itinerary, watching the numbers and details blur as the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. 3 years of my life, 18 months of careful planning, $8,400 in savings, all reduced to whatever, sounds fine, and a warning to friends about not letting me embarrass her. The apartment that had felt warm and welcoming an hour earlier now seemed like a museum of my own delusions, every carefully chosen detail mocking me with its optimism. The matching luggage by the door looked ridiculous now, like props in a play where only one actor knew the script had changed. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of the expensive Pinot Grigio I'd bought for her homecoming, tasting nothing but my own stupidity. The French candles sat unlit, the fresh flowers wilted slightly in their vase, the travel folder organized with pathetic precision on the counter. Everything I'd done to make this night special now felt like evidence of my complete misunderstanding of our relationship. Sierra was probably already in her Uber, texting Kennedy and Avery about her boyfriend's latest attempt at romance, rolling her eyes at the matching luggage and custom itinerary, turning my gestures of love into content for their group chat entertainment. In her world, I was the cautionary tale, the stable guy who tried too hard, the engineer who couldn't understand that spreadsheets and planning couldn't buy respect or passion. But sitting there alone with my thoughts and expensive wine, I realized something that would change everything about what happened next. The clarity that came with Sierra's brutal honesty was almost liberating in its completeness. I wasn't angry, which surprised me more than anything else about that night. Instead, I felt the kind of calm that comes with finally understanding a structural problem you've been trying to solve for months. The foundation of our relationship had been compromised from the beginning, and no amount of careful planning or romantic gestures could repair something that was never solid to start with. I finished the wine and made my decision with the same methodical precision I used for engineering calculations. Sierra had been clear about what I represented in her life, and I was going to respect that assessment completely. I walked to my laptop and began the process of systematically dismantling the future I'd built in my imagination. The Casa del Mar reservation was the first to go. I called their 24-hour concierge line and explained that I needed to cancel due to an emergency, accepting the 50% penalty without argument. $4,200 evaporated with a few keystrokes, but it felt like the cheapest lesson I'd ever learned about my own worth. The horseback riding tour, the private chef, the couple's massage at the spa, each cancellation brought a strange sense of relief rather than regret. I was cutting away dead weight, removing obligations to someone who saw me as a burden rather than a partner. The airline tickets required a phone call to customer service, where a sympathetic agent helped me navigate the change fees and restrictions. I kept one ticket for myself, deciding that I'd take a solo trip somewhere when I was ready, maybe visit my college roommate in Portland or finally see the Grand Canyon I'd been promising myself for years. The second ticket I canceled completely, eating the full cost because the idea of Sierra using it for some other purpose made my stomach turn. While I worked through the travel arrangements, I started gathering my belongings with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this move for months rather than hours. My engineering textbooks went into boxes first, then the precision instruments I used for freelance consulting work, followed by the diplomas and professional certificates that represented years of study and achievement. These were the things that defined me professionally, the proof that I was good at what I did even if I wasn't good enough for Sierra's social circle. The AutoCAD software manuals, structural analysis guides, and project management certification courses represented thousands of hours of study and professional development, investments in myself that had actual value unlike my futile attempts to impress someone who would never appreciate them. I packed my clothes with military precision, folding each item exactly as I'd learned during my brief stint in ROTC before switching to engineering. The expensive suits I'd bought for her company events, the casual clothes she'd criticized for being too practical, the workout gear she'd mocked for being unfashionable, all of it went into suitcases with the same careful organization I brought to everything else in my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was packing for a trip I'd never planned, leaving for a destination that was anywhere but here. My personal effects revealed how little of myself I'd actually brought into our shared space. 3 years of living together, and my possessions filled only 4 boxes and 2 suitcases, a stark reminder of how much I'd adapted my life to fit her preferences rather than creating something truly shared. The books were mine, the tools were mine, the diplomas were mine, but everything else belonged to her world, her aesthetic, her vision of how we should live. Even my coffee maker was a compromise, chosen because it matched her kitchen color scheme rather than for its brewing quality, another small surrender in the war of attrition that had defined our domestic life. I transferred my share of the utility payments and rent through our banking app, adding an extra month as a courtesy since my name was on the lease until December. The financial transactions felt clean and final, each completed payment severing another tie to a relationship that had apparently been over long before tonight's revelation. I even calculated my portion of the grocery bills and household supplies, leaving an envelope with cash to cover anything I might have forgotten. In my profession, you learn to document everything, to leave clear records that can't be misinterpreted later, and I applied that same principle to my departure. The corporate housing website had several furnished apartments available for immediate occupancy, and I selected one in a neighborhood I'd always liked but Sierra had dismissed as too boring. The lease application was completed online, credit check approved instantly, and I had keys to a new life by midnight. The efficiency of modern technology made disappearing easier than I'd expected, and the realization that I could rebuild my entire living situation in a few hours highlighted how little I'd actually invested in our shared domestic life beyond paying the bills. My final act before leaving was writing a note on my engineering firm's letterhead, keeping it as brief and professional as a project summary. I wrote about zero humiliation and issue resolved, signing it with my full name and professional credentials as if documenting the completion of a particularly challenging assignment. The formality of it felt appropriate somehow, treating the end of our relationship with the same attention to detail I'd brought to the beginning, except this time I was solving problems instead of creating them. The note was businesslike and final, the kind of communication that left no room for misinterpretation or negotiation, exactly the way I would conclude any failed project where the client had proven incompatible with successful outcomes. Loading my car with boxes and suitcases in the pre-dawn darkness felt like the most decisive action I'd taken in months. The building was quiet, most residents asleep and unaware that someone was methodically erasing himself from their neighbor's life. I made multiple trips, each one removing more evidence of my 3-year presence, until only the note remained on the kitchen counter next to the expensive wine bottle and wilted flowers. By sunrise, I was settling into my new apartment with coffee from a shop I'd never tried before, looking out at a view Sierra had never seen, planning a life she would never be part of again. The first message arrived Sunday evening while I was assembling furniture in my new living room, a simple text asking where all my stuff had gone. I read it while tightening the screws on a bookshelf, noted the confusion in her words, and returned to my task without responding. The second message came an hour later, more urgent, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. By Monday morning, my phone was buzzing constantly with increasingly frantic attempts at contact, each message revealing how completely unprepared she was for my absence. I had established a new routine with the methodical precision I brought to all my projects, starting each day with coffee at a different cafe, exploring neighborhoods I'd never had time to visit while accommodating Sierra's social schedule. The morning walks became a meditation of sorts, each step taking me further from the person I'd been in that relationship and closer to someone I was only beginning to rediscover. My evenings were spent in unfamiliar restaurants, reading books I'd neglected, or simply sitting in my new apartment enjoying the silence that came with living alone again. The corporate housing had come furnished with modern, functional pieces that suited my practical nature perfectly, and I found genuine pleasure in arranging the space according to my preferences rather than compromising with someone else's aesthetic vision. There was something deeply satisfying about choosing where to place my engineering books without considering whether they looked too nerdy on the shelves, or selecting a coffee table based purely on functionality rather than how it would photograph for social media. Even simple decisions like what to watch on television or what time to eat dinner felt revolutionary after years of deferring to someone else's preferences and schedule. My refrigerator contained food I actually wanted to eat rather than expensive organic products that looked good in Instagram stories, and I discovered I genuinely enjoyed cooking for myself when the results weren't subject to commentary about presentation or nutritional content. Sierra's messages evolved from confusion to anger to something approaching panic as the days passed and my silence continued. She demanded explanations, threatened to involve mutual friends, claimed I was being childish and dramatic over one comment. The progression was fascinating to observe from my position of complete detachment, like watching a case study in escalating desperation unfold in real time. She couldn't understand how someone she'd trained to respond to her every need had suddenly become unreachable, unmanageable, unavailable for the emotional labor she'd grown accustomed to demanding. I blocked her primary number after the messages became repetitive, only to discover she'd started using different phones, probably borrowing devices from Kennedy and Avery to circumvent my boundaries. Each new number brought the same cycle of confusion, anger, and manipulation, but I found myself developing an almost scientific interest in the patterns rather than feeling any emotional response to the content. The psychology was fascinating in its predictability, following textbook stages of grief and manipulation with mathematical precision. She tried guilt, reminding me of our shared history and the good times we'd supposedly enjoyed together, conveniently forgetting that most of those good times had involved me funding her lifestyle or accommodating her preferences. She attempted bargaining, promising to include me more in her social circle and treat me better in the future, as if the problem had been insufficient access to people who looked down on me rather than her fundamental lack of respect. She even resorted to threats, warning that I'd never find anyone better and would regret throwing away what we'd built together, apparently unaware that someone who viewed me as an embarrassment wasn't exactly setting a high bar for future relationships. The irony that she was now fighting for a relationship she'd been publicly ashamed of just days earlier wasn't lost on me, but it no longer carried any emotional weight. I had discovered something liberating about complete radio silence as a response to manipulation. Every unanswered message, every ignored voicemail, every blocked number sent a clearer message than any argument or explanation ever could. I wasn't playing hard to get or trying to punish her for her honesty about my inadequacies. I was simply no longer available for a relationship with someone who saw me as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a partner to be cherished. The silence became my most powerful statement, turning my absence into an unanswerable question that seemed to consume more of her attention than my presence ever had. My new neighborhood became a sanctuary where Sierra's existence felt increasingly irrelevant to my daily happiness. I joined a gym closer to my apartment, started attending a weekly lecture series at the downtown library, and even signed up for a photography class I'd been considering for years but never had time to pursue while managing Sierra's social calendar. Each new activity, each small pleasure I allowed myself, reinforced the realization that I'd been living a diminished version of my life for someone who didn't appreciate the sacrifice. The contrast between my growing contentment and her escalating desperation created an almost mathematical proof of how wrong our relationship had been for both of us. By the end of the second week, her messages had devolved into stream of consciousness rambling about how I was ruining her life by disappearing, how her friends were asking uncomfortable questions about my sudden absence, how she couldn't explain what had happened without admitting what she'd said about me. The woman who had been embarrassed to introduce me to her social circle was now embarrassed by having to explain my absence, and the poetic justice of her situation provided the first genuine amusement I'd felt in months. She was discovering that being single again meant losing not just my financial support but also the social credibility that came with being in a stable relationship, even with someone she considered beneath her standards. The tables had turned completely, and she was learning what it felt like to be the one left explaining awkward situations to judgmental friends. The real entertainment began when my college roommate Jake called me 3 weeks after my disappearance, barely able to contain his laughter as he shared what he'd learned through the interconnected web of Seattle's social media scene. Jake worked in tech marketing and somehow knew everyone who knew everyone, including people in Avery's influencer circle who had been following Sierra's situation with the kind of morbid fascination reserved for public relationship disasters. According to Jake's sources, Sierra's Vegas weekend had become a complete catastrophe the moment Kennedy and Avery realized her boyfriend had completely vanished without explanation. The friends who had been prepared to mock my social inadequacies were suddenly faced with the mysterious absence of someone they'd never actually met, and the intrigue had apparently captivated their entire social network. The story Jake told me was better than any revenge I could have planned myself. Kennedy and Avery had spent the entire Vegas trip pressing Sierra for details about what had happened, but she couldn't explain my disappearance without admitting what she'd said that triggered it. She was caught between confessing her own cruelty or appearing to be the victim of some inexplicable abandonment, and both options made her look bad to friends who were already questioning her judgment. The mysterious note I'd left had become legendary content in their influencer networks, with people sharing screenshots and speculating about what kind of man writes "zero humiliation," issue resolved and then completely disappears from someone's life. According to Jake's intelligence network, the note had gone viral among Seattle's young professional crowd as an example of the most ice-cold breakup in recent memory. People were analyzing the language, the professional letterhead, the complete absence of emotion or explanation, and concluding that whoever wrote it was either a sociopath or someone who had reached the absolute limit of his tolerance for disrespect. Sierra's carefully curated social media presence began crumbling under the weight of her friends' curiosity and her inability to control the narrative. Her Instagram posts became erratic, alternating between desperate attempts at normalcy and cryptic messages about toxic people and unexpected life changes. The comments sections filled with questions about her ghost boyfriend situation, with followers who had seen my occasional appearances in her photos demanding to know where I'd gone. She tried deleting photos that included me, but the internet never forgets, and people had already screenshot our couple photos for comparison with her new solo content. The influencer ecosystem that had once been her source of validation became a source of constant scrutiny as people dissected every post for clues about what had happened to make someone disappear so completely. Jake's sources reported that Kennedy had publicly sided with whoever wrote that legendary note during a live-stream discussion about relationship red flags, declaring that any man who could execute such a clean exit obviously had excellent reasons for leaving. Avery had shared the story during a podcast appearance, using it as an example of how women sometimes don't realize what they have until it's gone, though she never mentioned Sierra by name. The very friends who were supposed to support Sierra's narrative that I was inadequate were now treating my disappearance as evidence of strength and self-respect rather than weakness or cowardice. The social media investigation had revealed details about our relationship that painted Sierra in an increasingly unflattering light. People had noticed that her expensive lifestyle didn't match her marketing job salary, leading to speculation about who had been funding her designer wardrobe and luxury experiences. Screenshots of her old posts showed a pattern of expensive restaurants, weekend trips, and shopping hauls that clearly exceeded her income, and the timeline suggested that these luxuries had disappeared around the same time I did. The influencer community that thrived on authenticity and transparency was slowly realizing that Sierra's lifestyle had been largely subsidized by someone she was apparently ashamed to acknowledge publicly. Comment threads filled with people sharing their own experiences with partners who wanted financial support without public recognition, and Sierra's situation became a cautionary tale about taking generous partners for granted. The psychology of social media worked against her as people began questioning every aspect of her online persona, from her relationship status to her financial independence to her character as someone who would drive away a man stable enough to plan a romantic vacation and mature enough to leave without drama when disrespected. The detective work being done by strangers on the internet was more thorough than any private investigator could have managed, with people cross-referencing her posts with public records, professional directories, and mutual connections to piece together a complete picture of our relationship dynamics. They had identified the restaurants we'd frequented, estimated the costs of her wardrobe, and calculated the approximate income required to maintain her lifestyle on a marketing assistant salary. The math didn't add up, and people were drawing obvious conclusions about who had been making up the difference and why that person might have decided to stop. Screenshots comparing her posts from before and after my disappearance showed a dramatic shift in both frequency and content, with her once daily luxury lifestyle updates becoming sporadic posts about self-care and finding your worth. Jake forwarded me screenshots of the discussions happening in private group chats where Seattle's young professional crowd was debating what kind of woman could inspire such a decisive departure. The consensus seemed to be that whoever I was, I had demonstrated a level of self-respect and emotional intelligence that was rare in modern dating. People were impressed by the complete absence of social media drama, public arguments, or attempts to humiliate Sierra in return for whatever she had done. My silence was being interpreted as confidence rather than weakness, mystery rather than inadequacy, and strength rather than inability to fight for the relationship. The narrative had shifted completely from Sierra's version where I was an embarrassing boyfriend to a story where I was the one who got away after being unappreciated. Her friends were now asking uncomfortable questions about what she had done to drive away someone who clearly had his life together enough to disappear without creating drama or seeking sympathy. The investigation into my background had revealed my engineering career, my professional achievements, and my apparent financial stability, making Sierra's claims about my inadequacy seem increasingly implausible to people who were beginning to suspect she had been the problem in our relationship. The irony was delicious. Jake told me over beers at a bar Sierra had never heard of in a neighborhood she would have considered beneath her standards. People were talking about the mysterious engineer who had vanished like he was some kind of relationship urban legend, while Sierra was becoming known as the girl who drove away a good man for reasons she couldn't explain without looking terrible. The flying monkeys started arriving in my inbox about 6 weeks after my departure, a coordinated campaign of mutual friends and Sierra's family members attempting to broker a reconciliation through guilt and emotional manipulation. The first was her yoga instructor sister Morgan, who sent a lengthy message about family healing and second chances, apparently unaware that I'd never actually met her despite 3 years of dating her sister. Morgan's approach was all spiritual bypassing and toxic positivity, suggesting that holding grudges was bad for my chakras and that Sierra had been doing important inner work since I left. The irony of receiving relationship advice from someone Sierra had rarely mentioned wasn't lost on me, but I filed the message away unanswered like all the others. Next came our mutual friends from college, couples who had apparently been designated as neutral mediators in a conflict they didn't understand. Dave and Lisa reached out with invitations to dinner, ostensibly to catch up but obviously intended to facilitate some kind of intervention. Their messages were carefully worded to seem casual while making it clear they'd been briefed by Sierra about her version of events. When I politely declined their invitations without explanation, they became more direct, expressing concern about my well-being and suggesting I was handling the breakup in an unhealthy way by completely cutting contact. The assumption that my peace and contentment represented some kind of psychological damage revealed how little they understood about what had actually happened between Sierra and me. Sierra's escalation tactics became increasingly desperate as the weeks passed and my silence continued to hold. She started having therapy session screenshots delivered to my workplace, apparently believing that evidence of her commitment to personal growth would somehow obligate me to reconsider our relationship. The pages were carefully curated excerpts about communication styles and relationship patterns, with highlighted sections that painted her as someone working hard to become a better partner. The manipulation was transparent, but the fact that she was involving my professional environment crossed a line that required intervention from building security. I had to have an awkward conversation with my supervisor about personal matters affecting my workplace, explaining that an ex-girlfriend was attempting to contact me through company channels and that I needed their support in maintaining appropriate boundaries. The professional embarrassment of having to involve my career in personal drama was exactly the kind of situation I'd sought to avoid by leaving quietly, but Sierra's escalating behavior was forcing me to take defensive measures I'd hoped would be unnecessary. The handwritten apology letters began arriving at my apartment around the 2-month mark, elaborate productions that must have taken hours to compose and revise. The penmanship was perfect, the paper was expensive, and the content was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as contrition. She wrote about her mistakes, her regrets, her newfound understanding of what she'd lost when she drove me away. The letters were beautifully written and completely hollow, containing all the right words arranged in all the right ways without conveying any genuine understanding of why I'd left or what would need to change for a relationship to work between us. I recognized the voice of someone who had been coached by therapists and friends about what remorseful partners are supposed to say, but the calculated nature of the apologies made them feel more insulting than her original honesty about my inadequacies. Each letter followed the same formula of acknowledgement, responsibility, growth, and hope, as if she was working through a template for effective apologies rather than expressing genuine remorse or understanding. The envelopes piled up unopened after the first few, becoming physical evidence of someone's refusal to accept that not every problem could be solved through persistence and pretty words. The public ambush came during my lunch break at the cafe I'd been frequenting near my office, a violation of the careful boundaries I'd established around my new routine. Sierra appeared at my table like an apparition from my former life, clearly having stalked my social media or questioned mutual friends about my daily patterns. She looked different, smaller somehow, with an uncertainty that replaced her former confidence. The conversation was brief and painful, with her attempting to recreate the casual intimacy we'd once shared while I maintained the polite distance I'd use with any unwelcome stranger. She talked about missing me, about learning from her mistakes, about wanting to rebuild what we'd lost, but her words felt rehearsed and desperate rather than genuine. When I told her I wasn't interested in reconciliation, she became visibly frustrated by my calm refusal to engage with her emotional appeals. Her final gambit involved showing up at the engineering conference I was attending for professional development, a move that required significant research and planning on her part. She had somehow obtained information about my schedule and location, probably through social media reconnaissance or questioning people in my professional network. The desperation required to track down someone at their workplace conference and attempt a public reconciliation revealed just how far she was willing to go to regain control over a situation that had completely escaped her management. I spotted her in the hotel lobby before she saw me, giving me time to arrange alternative transportation and avoid the confrontation she'd planned. The incident was reported to hotel security as stalking behavior, and I filed a formal complaint with local police to establish a paper trail in case her behavior continued to escalate. Her final desperate move was the fake family emergency, a text message claiming her mother had been hospitalized and asking me to call immediately because she needed emotional support during a crisis. The manipulation was so transparent and cruel that I almost felt sorry for someone who would fabricate family tragedy to manipulate an ex-partner's emotions. Instead of responding, I checked her social media and discovered recent posts showing her mother enjoying a wine-tasting event, completely healthy and obviously unaware that her daughter was using her as bait in a manipulation scheme. The discovery that she would lie about family medical emergencies to force contact cemented my decision permanently, removing any remaining doubt about whether someone with such flexible ethics deserved access to my life or emotions. I documented the fake emergency with screenshots and added them to the growing file of evidence about her escalating attempts to violate the boundaries I'd established. The folder had grown thick with printed emails, saved voicemails, photographs of unwanted deliveries, and incident reports from security personnel, creating a comprehensive record of someone's complete inability to accept rejection with dignity. Each incident reinforced my conviction that disappearing had been the right choice, and that someone willing to employ such desperate tactics was exactly the kind of person I needed to avoid permanently. The pattern revealed someone who viewed relationships as negotiations rather than partnerships, who believed that persistence could overcome incompatibility, and who was fundamentally unable to accept that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt once they'd been burned. The professional way I'd handled her escalating behavior, documenting everything and involving appropriate authorities when necessary, felt like a natural extension of the methodical approach I'd taken to ending our relationship in the first place. The ultimate confrontation came at Dave and Lisa's anniversary party 6 months after my disappearance, an event I'd initially planned to skip until Jake convinced me that hiding from social gatherings would only give Sierra more power over my life choices. I arrived fashionably late, having learned through mutual friends that Sierra would be attending, and spent the first hour reconnecting with people I'd neglected during my relationship years. The conversations were refreshing, filled with genuine interest in my work and personal projects rather than the superficial small talk that had characterized most social interactions when I was constantly managing Sierra's image concerns. I was discussing sustainable bridge design with Penelope, an environmental lawyer who had an impressive understanding of infrastructure policy, when I spotted Sierra across the room watching our conversation with obvious distress. Penelope was everything Sierra wasn't: intellectually curious, professionally accomplished, and genuinely interested in ideas rather than appearances. She asked thoughtful questions about my engineering projects, shared insights about environmental regulations affecting construction, and laughed at my admittedly terrible jokes about load-bearing beams and structural integrity. The contrast with Sierra's usual eye-glaze tolerance for my work topics was stark, and I found myself genuinely enjoying a conversation with an attractive woman for the first time in years. Penelope had this way of connecting environmental law to practical engineering challenges that made me see my own work from new perspectives, discussing carbon footprint reduction in construction materials and sustainable design principles that could influence my future projects. Her enthusiasm for renewable energy systems and green building standards matched my own growing interest in environmental engineering, and I realized we could build something intellectually stimulating together rather than just emotionally exhausting. Sierra's approach was inevitable, and I could see her gathering courage across the room as she watched Penelope and me discover shared interests in sustainable development and urban planning. When she finally made her move, walking over with the determined stride of someone executing a carefully planned intervention, I felt more curious than anxious about how she would attempt to disrupt a conversation she was clearly too intimidated to join naturally. Her greeting was artificially bright, the kind of performative friendliness that immediately signaled to everyone present that drama was incoming. She positioned herself between Penelope and me with territorial body language, extending her hand to Penelope with a smile that didn't reach her eyes while making it clear that she expected to be recognized as having prior claim to my attention. The awkwardness was immediate and obvious, with Penelope politely acknowledging the introduction while clearly recognizing the dynamics at play. Sierra's attempt to insert herself into our conversation about environmental policy was painfully transparent, offering superficial comments about recycling and clean energy that revealed her complete lack of understanding about the complex regulatory frameworks Penelope and I had been discussing. The desperation in her voice as she tried to demonstrate relevance to topics she'd never shown interest in during our 3-year relationship was both sad and infuriating. When Penelope excused herself to get a drink, clearly uncomfortable with the obvious tension, Sierra launched into her planned speech about second chances and personal growth, apparently believing that she could corner me into a reconciliation conversation at a public event. She talked about the therapy she'd been attending, the insights she'd gained about her behavior patterns, and her newfound appreciation for what we'd built together. The irony that she was describing our relationship as something we'd built together, when she'd spent 3 years criticizing my contributions and being embarrassed by my existence, wasn't lost on me. I let her finish her prepared remarks before responding with the same calm professionalism I'd used to deliver an engineering report. I told her that I appreciated her commitment to personal growth but that I wasn't interested in rebuilding a relationship with someone who had described me as an embarrassment to be managed rather than a partner to be cherished. When she attempted to minimize her previous comments as jokes taken out of context, I reminded her that telling friends not to let me embarrass her wasn't exactly ambiguous language. Her public meltdown was spectacular, escalating from tears to accusations about my coldness to dramatic declarations about throwing away 5 years together over a misunderstanding. The mathematical error was typical of someone who rewrote history to suit her narrative, since we'd dated for 3 years, not 5. My response was quiet and firm, thanking her for the honest feedback that had helped me optimize my life choices and find someone who actually appreciated my methodical approach. The engineering language was deliberately chosen to highlight the contrast between my calm professionalism and her emotional manipulation. When Penelope returned and smoothly rejoined our conversation, Sierra's humiliation was complete. The rest of the evening proceeded without incident, with Penelope and me continuing our discussion about sustainable infrastructure while pointedly ignoring the occasional glares from across the room. By the time Sierra left early with some excuse about feeling unwell, I had Penelope's number and plans for dinner the following weekend. The victory felt clean and complete, not because I'd humiliated Sierra publicly, but because I'd demonstrated the kind of man I'd become in her absence. Months later, as Penelope and I planned our own trip to Iceland, her choice of destination reflecting her interest in geothermal energy systems and my fascination with Nordic engineering solutions, Sierra's final desperate text arrived asking for closure. The message was long and rambling, full of questions about what she could have done differently and requests for one final conversation to process our relationship's end. Penelope read the message over my shoulder while we researched volcanic landscapes and renewable energy installations, then suggested we use the printed text as kindling for the fireplace in our hotel room. The symbolism was perfect, and watching the last connection to my past relationship literally go up in smoke while planning a future with someone who valued my engineering mind and practical nature felt like the most satisfying conclusion possible. The difference between Sierra and Penelope was evident in every aspect of how we planned our trip together, with Penelope suggesting we visit geothermal power plants and sustainable architecture projects instead of luxury resorts and shopping districts. She wanted to understand how Iceland had achieved carbon neutrality through innovative engineering, while Sierra would have been focused on getting the perfect Instagram photos at expensive restaurants. Penelope appreciated my detailed itinerary and backup plans, calling my thoroughness impressive rather than obsessive, and she contributed her own research about environmental policies we could explore together. We split expenses equally without discussion, both contributing our professional expertise to create an educational and romantic experience. Sierra's desperate final message asking for closure became the literal kindling for our first romantic fire together, the perfect metaphor for how completely I'd moved beyond the person who had once made me feel inadequate for being exactly who I was meant to be.